Dover, as we've heard from several of the papers today, has a long history as a key location in Kent. It's a key location for trade and exploration. It's a geopolitical frontier, and for many, many centuries, it was the primary point of embarkation for the continent. In the cultural imagination, Dover is traditionally associated with notions of identity, home, national pride, and is often seen as a symbol of British safety and strength. But between 1789 and 1815, the period of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, Dover and the Channel crossing that started from Dover took on a slightly different or a new significance. Dover became more explicitly a site along a martial border. It became a kind of defense against foreign invasion. And the Channel crossing from Dover to Calais especially became a passage that was subject to regulation and policing, not to mention fear. Restrictions in traffic and communication across the Channel meant that apart from the 2-year interlude created by the Peace of Amiens from 1801 to 1803, and I'm quoting from a critic here, few travelers willingly went to France apart from spies and British sympathizers with the revolution. However, romantic writers such as Frances Burney, Hester Thrale Piazzi, Maria Edgeworth, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Robinson, Percy and Mary Shelley, Dorothy and William Wordsworth, and Lord Byron all crossed the Channel either to or from Dover in this period, and they wrote about this journey in their poems, novels, memoirs, travelogues, letters, and diaries. So in what follows, I'd like to look briefly at the accounts left by the Shelleys, by Mary Robinson, and by Mary Wollstonecraft in particular. All of these writers figure Dover, or the Channel crossing more specifically, as a liminal space. And someone earlier was talking about not liminal spaces, but transitional spaces. And actually, I'm wondering now if maybe my term should be transitional space. But anyway, I'm going to call it a liminal space. Although these writers don't focus on geopolitical significance of the journey that they're making, they all invoke it as the implicit framework for other thresholds that are being crossed. As one French historian has suggested, what traveler leaving Calais or arriving in Dover could fail to think that he was leaving one frontier and meeting another? My argument is that these frontiers are not simply geographical or national or political, but also deeply personal. Each of these texts involves a physical movement from one place to another, but at the same time conveys a transition between an old and a new state of being, or rather an old and a new identity. This transition of identity is perhaps most clearly seen in the writings of the Shelleys, who some of you may know, but for those who don't, traveled from Dover to Calais and then across Europe in the summer of 1814. A short description of this journey comprises the opening scene of their co-authored History of a 6 Weeks Tour, which was published anonymously in 1817. And there's also a longer and less censored version that I'll draw on in Percy Shelley's diary entries, which of course were not published until much, much later. The voyage begins, according to Mary, on a beautiful evening, but the waters soon become so violent as to render Mary dreadfully seasick, and a storm arrives that makes her fear for her life. She says, "Suddenly a thunder squall struck the sail, and the waves rushed into the boat. Even the sailors acknowledged that our situation was perilous." Though eventually the couple reaches Calais safely, and she wakes up, quote, "from a comfortless sleep to see the sun rise broad, red, and cloudless over the pier." So emerging from this dark night of illness and mortal danger, Mary and Percy see the sunrise on the French coast, and this is a kind of suggestion almost of a rebirth or a hopeful new beginning. Percy Shelley's uncensored account offers details that both amplify and clarify the stakes of the journey for these two young people. So these are, of course, young lovers eloping to the continent against the wishes of Mary's father, and in spite of the fact that 21-year-old Percy Shelley is actually already married. So this is very much a kind of illicit or transgressive journey. Um, Percy's diary entry highlights his elation at being reunited with Mary. So he says, "Mary was ill as we traveled, yet in that illness, what pleasure and security did we not share?" So you can really, he's got exclamation points, and you can really feel his joy, his kind of relief. And he also makes plain the physical intimacy between them. So there are several lines, but for example, he says, "She lay in my arms through the night, her head in rest on my bosom." So of course she's completely travel sick, but he finds this very romantic because she's kind of resting on him. Um, he also has this kind of moment of existential contemplation, and he conveys not so much a fear of death as a sense of death or his the inconvenience of death if it were to arrive just now, just at the time when he's finally managed, however scandalously, to leave behind his obligations of his old life and to embark on a new one based on intellectual and physical passion. So he says, "I had time in that moment to reflect and even to reason on death. It was rather a thing of discomfort and disappointment than horror to me. We should never be separated, but in death we might not know and feel our union as now." And I think there's definitely a kind of physical aspect to what he suggests there. Mary's account elides these details, but it nevertheless uses the boat trip, the storm, and the sunset to render the stakes of their journey figuratively. Mary, especially, is risking a lot. She's risking her reputation, her social status, her family ties, not to mention her life. Of course, she can't mention all of these in the published version of the text, but there is a sense even here that crossing the channel marks a transition into a space that is perilous, not only physically, but also socially and personally. And certainly for both Mary and Percy, the channel crossing is a symbolic beginning. It's the start of their elopement and the lifelong relationship that was to follow. It's the start of the text itself. This is actually the opening passage of History of a 6 Weeks Tour. But also the start of their ongoing professional collaboration that lasted right up until Percy Shelley's death. And actually, it all started at Dover. So Percy says in his diary, "She was in my arms, we were safe, we were on our road to Dover." So that's where the start of this is. Um, a change of status is also at the heart of the Romantic poet Mary Robinson's poem called "Stanzas Written Between Dover and Calais, July 20th, 1792." So this is an autobiographical poem which sees her leaving behind her country and her unfaithful lover and risking hostile shores to forge a newfound identity as a single woman on the continent. Actually, it's going to be quite a brief trip to the continent, but never mind, that's not included in the poem itself. She wrote this poem 3 years after the start of the French Revolution, at a time when traffic across the Channel had just started to become restricted. So this is actually much earlier than the excerpt I just read from the Shelleys. The title of the poem registers the political, historical, and geographical contexts of its composition, even if the lines themselves are actually focused much more on the failed relationship between Robinson and her lover. So the poem characterizes Robinson as a figure of suffering. She's a kind of jilted woman um, who is, bemoaning her unworthy lover. And in contrast to her own loyalty and devotion over their 10-year relationship, she portrays her lover as unfaithful and inconstant. with a vagrant mind and feelings which are, quote, wavering as the passing wind. So unlike him, she's not going to, quote, seek a cure in ranging. And by that, she means she's not going to move on to someone else, but she's going to bear the pain of loss in what she calls silent grief. And she, quote, disdains the thought of changing, proudly destined to endure. So she's really emphasizing her ability to endure, to bear pain, and the fact that she will continue to stay constant, at least in her feelings for him. She's almost happy to flee to France, or what she calls Gallia's hostile shore, where she is going to embrace what she calls a mournful exile. And yet, this avowal of kind of stoicism and steadiness is undermined by a dynamic sense of movement in the poem. There are verbs such as wander, fly, go, lead, waft, part. Prepositional phrases of direction, such as, across the troubled deep, suggest her mobility and her activity, and suggest that she's not simply enduring the pain of loss, but actually taking action to move on. And in fact, Robinson contrasts two different kinds of movement in this poem, one that is metaphorical and one that is physical. So there is the inconstancy of her lover's affections, which is figured in kinetic terms. So he has, quote, a vagrant mind, a bosom prone to ranging, he's a rover, and all of this is in opposition to her as a kind of steady, unchanging, kind of steadfast lover, and ultimately someone who has kind of unrequited love for him. This opposition seems to cut across traditional gender lines. But physically, Robinson's body is moving, not only moving on, but actually physically moving. She actually wrote these lines kind of en route to the continent, and the title of the poem makes plain that there is a movement that is the kind of backdrop for the composition of this poem. There's a tension here between movement as self-willed and movement that is compelled. But Robinson clearly exercises a more traditionally masculine agency in being the one to distance herself physically from her lover and to be the one not only moving on but moving away. So she's the one who makes their separation final, and she's also the one who announces it publicly. So she's treading a fine line here. She plays her age-old public role as the, quote, poet of love gone wrong, courting the sympathies of the reader for the kind of jilted lover. And yet she's also the one who authors this episode, who makes the private life into a very public text, makes her private life into a very public text. The title frames the text as a kind of exodus, a leave-taking, that's highlighted in capital letters in the final line of the poem, where she says, "Now we part to meet no more," and all that is in capitals. The poem ends with her arrival in Calais, with an affirmation of the finality of their separation, which can be seen as either a last lament or a first step in this new path ahead of her. Either way, Robinson's status has changed by the end of the poem. Her relationship is over, but she is refusing to allow herself to be defined in passive or sedentary terms. Even if she's the one who is rejected, and even if she's the one who's still constant in her love, she will not be left behind. Moreover, she's actually capitalizing on her experience, however genuinely painful, as an opportunity for publication. And lots of critics have argued, have discussed how the strategy of remaining recognizably feminine whilst also performing unintelligible gender roles, for example, crossing the channel during a time of war, has proven to be a very commercially rewarding one for women writers, and Robinson was well aware of this. So I'd like to move on to my final example, which is Mary Wollstonecraft, who, like Robinson, writes about Dover in conjunction with the dissolution of a romantic relationship. So in the autumn of 1795, Wollstonecraft returned to Britain from the continent, having cut her planned expedition short on account of the presence of the French army. And in the final chapter of her 1796 publication, Letters Written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, this is the final publication of her life. Her description of her homecoming is saturated with feelings of weariness and weariness and dejection. Actually, there's rejection there too, but it's overtly kind of weariness and dejection. Her private letters from this time tell us more. She is exhausted with traveling and she longs for home. And she says, "No poor tempest-tossed mariner ever more earnestly longed to arrive at his port." But at the same time, she experiences a flood of sorrow at the thought of arriving, not only because she has, quote, "no place to go," but also because she knows that she will be, what she says, landing without having any friend to receive me. The placelessness that she feels is both physical and relational. Dover seems, quote, "a dirty place" to her, and its cliffs are insignificant, that's her word, not only because Dover pales in comparison with the grander Scandinavian topographies that she's just recently seen, but because it no longer restores to her the sense of home and security that she craves. If, as Sarah Mills, a kind of modern critic, if as Sarah Mills has argued, spatial relations are bound up with social relations, the rejection that Wollstonecraft anticipates experiencing from her lover is figured here as a feeling of displacement. Her return home is soured by this anticipated pain of loss. So she has the sense from her lover's letters to her that he's basically moved on, and in fact he had. And she kind of she's sensed that rejection, and she knows that this relationship is ending. And so her return is really soured by this feeling of being alone. By the end of her journey, her sense of herself, of her life, has shifted, such that her long-awaited return home ironically sees her questioning not only who she is, but where she belongs. Interestingly, Wollstonecraft also, like Robinson, contrasts her lover with herself, suggesting that they are, quote, "differently organized." So she, very much like Robinson, sees herself as faithful, seeking permanent happiness, whereas her lover, who is basically, about to kind of end things with her, quote, "pursues the caprices of the moment and cares only for momentary gratification." She suggests that for him, quote, "self-interest is the principal mobile." Her choice of language here is striking. She's using this noun, mobile, or mobile, as I would say in my sort of American pronunciation, in the archaic sense of the meaning, which according to the Oxford English Dictionary is a cause of motion or a motive for action. So her diction connects movement and motion with motivation. And the implication is that her own mobile, her cause of motion, her motive for action is not self-interest, but regard for another. Her travels, her movements through space, her return back home to Dover are all thus linked to her affective relationships in a way that her lovers are not, or so she insinuates. Modern critic Karen Lawrence has argued that the genres, plot, and tropes of travel and adventure have been useful for British women writers in supplying alternative models for women's place in society, and for replacing the static mapping of women as space with a more dynamic model of women as agents or self-movers. And yet, as we saw with Robinson, that agency is not necessarily entirely self-willed. Or it is self-willed, but perhaps somehow less selfish than its male counterpart. So there are some kind of gendered concepts floating in here. Anyway, to conclude, all these writers depict Dover and the passage across the Channel without explicitly ruminating on the geopolitical importance of this journey. Rather, the context offers one frontier crossing on which are layered other kinds of thresholds to be crossed. These accounts all track a movement from one place or one country to another, but also detail transitions between different states of being or identities. So the movement across the channel becomes a symbolic journey of selfhood that leaves the writers transformed in very personal ways. For the Shelleys, most simply, we can say this is the dawn of a new life together, however transgressive or scandalous. For Robinson and for Wollstonecraft, this is the painful end of a romantic relationship, the beginning of a single existence, and all the ramifications that has, because of course both of these both of these women were mothers um, as well as the prospect of forging a new identity alone. For women whose identities have traditionally been governed by changes in marital status and whose lives have been defined and confined by the norms of domestic stasis, these texts offer potentially a new paradigm for self-fashioning. They map shifts in identity onto physical movements in space, combating the static notion of a woman's place, and using danger, risk, and pain as strategies for establishing textual authority and commercial appeal. I know I've only looked at a handful of these accounts of crossing the channel, and only very briefly, but I hope I've shed some new light on the ways in which women were writing about Dover in the Romantic period. Thank you.
Susan, thank you very much.